Christopher jolted awake, the harsh motel room light blinding his eyes. A glance at the clock confirmed his worst fears. It was well past midnight. Sheila, his partner in both love and crime, was nowhere to be found. A cold dread settled over him, a familiar feeling that always accompanied her absences. He swung his legs over the bed, the worn mattress groaning in protest. A quick scan of the room revealed nothing out of the ordinary. No discarded clothing, no half-smoked cigarettes, no clues as to her whereabouts. He knew where to look, a seedy corner of town where desperation and desire intertwined. With a grim determination, he pulled on his clothes and slipped out of the motel room. The night air was thick with the stench of stale beer and cheap cigarettes. As he navigated the dimly lit streets, his mind raced. He had to find her before she got herself into trouble. And there she was, a silhouette against the darkened van. Her figure was slumped against the passenger side window, her voice soft and seductive. A surge of anger and protectiveness washed over him. He quickened his pace, his heart pounding in his chest. "Sheila!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the quiet night. She jumped, startled, and turned to face him. Her eyes, usually filled with a mischievous glint, were now clouded with fear. "Christopher, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Before she could answer, the van's driver emerged from the shadows, a burly man with a menacing scowl. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he growled. Christopher, ever the quick thinker, feigned authority. "I'm a police officer. We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area." The man's face contorted with fear. He hesitated, then quickly slid back into the van and sped away. Christopher turned his attention back to Sheila. "What were you thinking?" he demanded. "I needed the money, Chris," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "We're barely scraping by. We need something more, something better. Prostituting yourself isn't the answer." "Sheila," he said, his voice firm. "There's a better way." They walked back to the motel, the silence between them heavy and oppressive. Sheila's tears fell silently, each drop a testament to her despair. "I want to stop, Chris," she sobbed. "I want a real life, a normal life. But we need the money, now more than ever." Christopher knew she was right. They were trapped in a vicious cycle, a desperate struggle to survive. But he also knew that there had to be a way out. Later that day, he dialed a number he hadn't called in years. The phone rang a few times before a familiar voice answered. "Christopher, long time no see," the voice said, a hint of amusement in his tone. "I need a favor, Marcus," Christopher replied, his voice serious. "A big one." Marcus was an illicit banker, a man who operated in the shadows, pulling the strings of the city's underworld. He was dangerous, ruthless, and incredibly wealthy. But he was also a friend, a connection that could open doors to a world of opportunity. "What do you want, Chris?" Marcus asked, his voice growing colder. "I want to work for you," Christopher said, his voice steady. "I'll do whatever you ask, as long as you provide the resources." Marcus was silent for a long moment. "You're sure you know what you're getting into, Chris?" "I'm sure," Christopher replied. "It's time to turn the page." And with that, a dangerous game began. A game that would test the limits of their loyalty, their morality, and their very souls. Christopher stared at the phone, feeling a chill creep down his spine as the conversation with Marcus lingered in his thoughts. He knew what he was doing. This was the point of no return. Once he stepped into Marcus's world, there would be no going back. But the desperation, the suffocating weight of his and Sheila's circumstances, left him with little choice. He took a deep breath and pressed the phone back to his ear, just in time to hear Marcus's voice again. "All right, Chris, I'll take you up on your offer. But know this, you won't be just a hired hand. You're in. And once you're in, there's no way out." The words sent a shiver down Christopher's spine, but he forced himself to focus. "I understand," he replied, his voice steady, betraying none of the unease twisting in his gut. "When do we meet?" "Tomorrow," Marcus said, his tone as cold and calculating as ever. "Don't waste my time, Chris. Bring Sheila. We'll talk then." The line went dead, and Christopher exhaled sharply, his heart racing. He stared at the phone for a moment longer before setting it down on the table. Sheila was already asleep on the bed, her face pale and tear-streaked from their earlier confrontation. He watched her for a long time, his thoughts swirling in dark, uncertain patterns. He had always promised her that things would get better, that there was a way out of this grim existence. But now, as he faced the reality of what Marcus's offer meant, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that he was leading them both down a path of no return. He slid into the chair at the small table beside the bed, his mind spinning. The flashing neon lights from outside painted strange, haunting shadows across the room. The idea of working for Marcus, of stepping into the shadowy world of crime that he had once avoided, was a heavy weight to bear. But what choice did he have? Sheila was slipping away, and he was losing her, piece by piece. He had to do something, anything, to save her. The next evening, Christopher and Sheila stood in front of an unassuming warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building, tucked between abandoned factories and rundown shops, looked like it could have been a place for forgotten dreams and broken promises. But Christopher knew better. This was the heart of Marcus's operations, hidden in plain sight. Sheila squeezed his hand, her grip tight, and glanced up at him. "Are you sure about this, Chris?" Her voice was small, almost fragile, a stark contrast to the hard, gritty city around them. He met her eyes, his face set in determination. "I have no choice, Sheila. This is the only way we're getting out of this." A doubt flickered in her gaze, but she didn't say anything else. They moved forward together, each step a quiet protest against the world they had found themselves in. As they reached the warehouse door, Christopher knocked twice, quick, deliberate raps. A small window on the door slid open, and a pair of cold eyes regarded them for a moment before the door creaked open. "Mr. Drake's expecting you," the man said, his voice gruff, and he stepped aside, allowing them to enter. Inside, the warehouse was filled with the hum of distant machinery, the clinking of metal, and the low murmur of voices. The space was cavernous, dimly lit by hanging bulbs and the occasional flicker of a neon sign from the nearby street. It smelled of oil, sweat, and something darker, something Christopher couldn't quite place but had learned to recognize over the years. It was the smell of danger. A few moments later, they were led to a back office where Marcus sat behind a large oak desk, his face obscured by the shadows. He was a man who liked to maintain control, always in the shadows, always watching. "Chris," Marcus greeted, his voice smooth and cold. "And Sheila, it's been a long time." Christopher didn't respond immediately. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and then nodded toward Sheila. "This is my partner, Sheila. We're here for your offer." Marcus's eyes flicked to Sheila, and for a moment, his expression softened ever so slightly, as if considering something. "I can see why you'd bring her," he said, his tone neutral. "The two of you are a perfect pair, in more ways than one." Sheila stiffened at the insinuation, but Christopher placed a hand on her arm, signaling her to stay quiet. "Let's get to it," Christopher said. "What's the deal, Marcus?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "It's simple, really. I need someone who's willing to do the work others are too scared to take on. This city's full of opportunities, and a man with your skills could do very well here. But you'll need to make a choice, Chris." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the air. "Are you willing to do whatever it takes to succeed, or are you just playing games?" Christopher's jaw tightened, and he glanced at Sheila, who stood beside him, her lips pressed together in a tight line. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, could sense the fear that was starting to rise in her chest. She wasn't cut out for this world. But was he? "I'm willing," Christopher replied, his voice low and steady, despite the knot of anxiety in his stomach. "What's the first job?" Marcus smiled, a cold, calculating smile, and stood up. He moved toward the back of the room, where a large map of the city was pinned to the wall. "I need you to deliver something," he said, pointing at a red circle on the map. "A package. It's time-sensitive and needs to be delivered by tomorrow night. You'll meet someone at the location. They'll give you the details." Christopher took a moment to process the information, then nodded. "What's in the package? Does it matter?" Marcus replied, his voice as casual as ever. "Your job is simple. Get it there, and you'll have earned my trust." Christopher swallowed hard. There was no turning back now. He turned to Sheila, meeting her eyes. For the briefest moment, he saw the terror in her gaze, but she didn't say a word. She knew what was happening. She knew what he had just committed to. He had made a deal with the devil. The next night, under the cover of darkness, Christopher and Sheila found themselves parked outside a dingy apartment complex in a part of town they had always avoided. The air was thick with tension, and the distant sound of police sirens only added to the unease that had settled in Christopher's chest. "I don't like this, Chris," Sheila said, her voice shaking. "I know you're doing this for us, but I don't want to be part of this world." "I'm not asking you to be part of it," Christopher replied, his hand gripping the steering wheel tightly. "But I'm not leaving here without you. We're getting out of this, Sheila. I swear it." She nodded, but her eyes were distant, filled with a sadness he couldn't erase. They got out of the car, the night air biting at their skin, and walked toward the entrance of the building. As they ascended the stairwell, Christopher's mind raced. He knew that tonight's delivery could change everything. He had no idea what was in the package, but he couldn't afford to ask. Marcus had been clear about one thing. No questions, no hesitation. At the top of the stairs, a man stood waiting. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his face expressionless as he approached them. "Package?" he asked flatly. Christopher handed it over, his heart pounding as he did. The man nodded and turned, vanishing into the shadows without another word. They watched him disappear before Christopher turned to Sheila. "We did it. Let's go. It's over." But deep down, he knew that this was just the beginning. The stakes were higher now, and the price of their freedom was something neither of them was prepared to pay. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The once peaceful, predictable lives that Christopher and Sheila had known were gone, swallowed up by a world of deception, bloodshed, and danger. They had crossed a threshold they could never return from. What had begun as a single, seemingly innocent task had unraveled into a chaotic, deadly game that consumed their every waking moment. It all started with the delivery, an assignment so simple it had seemed almost too good to be true. A discreet exchange, a few crates, a few $1,000s in their hands. How could they have known that would be the entry point into a world of high-stakes heists, underground casinos, and the sort of men whose loyalty was only as deep as their next betrayal? The job was meant to be a stepping stone, an easy route to a better life, but it became a gateway to a nightmare they couldn't escape. At first, the rewards were easy to see. Their bank accounts swelled, and their days were filled with the kind of luxuries they had only dreamed of before. Sheila, once a timid and soft-spoken woman, found herself growing stronger by the day. She had discovered a side of herself she never knew existed, one that was sharp, unyielding, and capable of handling whatever the underworld threw her way. Her transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. Where she had once hesitated to speak her mind, she now stood tall, speaking with authority. No longer was she the shrinking wallflower. Sheila had become a force to be reckoned with. Christopher, on the other hand, was a study in contrast. While Sheila thrived in this dangerous new world, he began to feel the weight of their choices pressing down on him. At first, it had all seemed like a game, high risk, high reward, the kind of adventure that had once seemed exciting. But as the weeks wore on, Christopher found himself growing more disillusioned. The money was never enough to drown out the gnawing feeling in his gut, the constant reminders of the lives they were ruining, the futures they were destroying. He could see the faces of the people they betrayed, faces of desperation, of fear, of helplessness. Each deal, each new task, seemed to cost someone something irrevocable, and the more he saw, the harder it became to reconcile the man he had been with the man he was becoming. But the spiral only deepened, and soon, there was no turning back. They were trapped in a game they couldn't win, and yet, there was no way to escape. It was too late for second thoughts. There were only choices now, and those choices were leading them further into the darkness. One night, Marcus summoned them to a meeting. The atmosphere was tense, far more so than usual. The flickering neon lights outside cast strange shadows in the small, dimly lit bar where they met. Marcus sat in his usual spot, the corner booth, a place that had long since become a symbol of his power. But tonight, his usual calm demeanor was gone. His eyes were bloodshot, his brow furrowed in an expression that could only be described as worry. His fingers tapped impatiently on the edge of his glass, the only sign of his agitation. "This city is changing," Marcus said, his voice low and deliberate. "A rival gang, led by a man named Vito, has been making moves. They're moving in on my territory, trying to take everything we've worked for." Christopher leaned forward instinctively, his gut tightening with a feeling he couldn't explain. He knew what was coming next. "They're a threat, Chris," Marcus continued, his eyes narrowing. "And we need to eliminate them." Christopher's throat went dry. He had seen the dangers of the underworld firsthand, had felt the heat of violence close enough to burn his skin. But he had never been involved in a full-scale war, a battle for territory that would leave blood in the streets. He had always known there would be a price to pay, but he had never imagined this. "How do you want us to handle it?" Sheila asked, her voice sharp. She had grown accustomed to taking the lead in these situations, and her new confidence shone through in her words. Marcus studied her for a long moment, his eyes assessing. "You'll do what you do best," he said slowly. "Gather intel, strike fast, take them out. There's no room for hesitation. We eliminate them before they get any stronger. This is a war, and in war, there's no mercy." Christopher didn't speak. He couldn't. He felt as though a weight had dropped into his stomach, as though the ground beneath him had suddenly become unstable. His mind raced with the potential consequences. He had no idea how deep this would go, or what they would have to sacrifice to come out alive. "We'll do it," he said finally, the words coming out like a confession. There was no turning back now. The following weeks were a blur of shadows and bloodshed. The once neat lines between right and wrong blurred into a haze of gunfire, whispered deals, and betrayals. Every street corner, every alley became a battlefield. Christopher and Sheila were thrust into the thick of it, using every skill they had acquired in the underworld to track down and eliminate members of Vito's gang, to send a message, to make their presence felt. But it wasn't just physical violence that marred the city. It was the mental toll it took on them. The gunfights, the constant fear that death was just around the corner, the moral decay that seeped into every part of their lives. Even Sheila, who had once embraced the danger with open arms, began to show signs of wear. The thrill was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. She started having trouble sleeping, the images of death and violence playing on a loop in her mind. Her hands would shake, and when she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of those she had killed, or those she had allowed to be killed. Christopher, too, began to unravel. Each kill was a crack in the wall of his sanity. The weight of their actions crushed him with every passing day. The money they had earned seemed so insignificant compared to the damage they had caused. He began to think of their old life, of the dreams they had once had, the future they had once imagined. But it all felt so far away, as if it belonged to another person entirely. Then one night, it all came crashing down. Christopher and Sheila had been preparing for a meeting, a deal that would shift the power dynamics between Marcus and Vito. They were in their safe house, finalizing the plans, when the door exploded inward. A deafening gunshot rang through the room, and a masked figure appeared in the doorway, firing relentlessly. Chaos erupted. Sheila dove for cover, instinctively pulling Christopher down with her. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, and the air was thick with smoke and fear. In the confusion, it became clear that this wasn't just an attack. It was an assassination. Someone had sold them out. As the shooting continued, Christopher and Sheila scrambled to escape, managing to slip out of the back door and into the night. They ran, heartbeats pounding in their ears, barely making it out alive. They didn't stop until they reached a remote part of the city, far from the burning wreckage of their lives. There, in the silence of the night, they made a decision. "We're done," Sheila said, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't looking at Christopher, but at the stars above them, at the future that was no longer theirs. We can't keep going. We need to leave this place. Christopher, his heart heavy with the burden of everything they had done, nodded. He didn't have to think twice. Their time in this world had ended. There was nothing left for them here. They left the city in the dead of night, abandoning everything they had built, everything they had fought for. But as they disappeared into the unknown, the weight of their choices remained, an invisible chain that would follow them wherever they went. They had crossed a line, and no matter how far they ran, there was no escaping the fallout. In the days, months, and years that followed, they would carry the scars of their past with them. They would try to rebuild their lives, to find some semblance of normalcy. But they would never forget the choices they had made, the lives they had destroyed, the darkness they had embraced. It would stay with them, a constant reminder that there was no going back. And though they were free from Marcus's grip, they would always be haunted by the fallout. Christopher and Sheila fled the city, their hearts heavy with guilt and the weight of their past actions. They sought refuge in a small, quiet town, where they could fade into the background and try to rebuild their lives. But the past was never truly gone. It lingered in the shadows, threatening to consume them. They found work in a small diner, Sheila as a waitress and Christopher as a dishwasher. It was a humble existence, a far cry from the glamorous and dangerous life they had once led. Yet, in this simplicity, they found a sense of peace they hadn't known in years. The town was a place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were rare and trust was easily earned. The townsfolk welcomed them with open arms, unaware of their dark past. They were given a second chance, a chance to be someone new, someone better. Slowly but surely they began to heal. Sheila, with her infectious smile and kind heart, became a beloved member of the community. Christopher, however, struggled to let go of the past. He was haunted by nightmares, flashbacks, and a constant fear of being discovered. One day, a mysterious stranger arrived in town. He was a man with a dark past, a man who had made mistakes similar to their own. He recognized the pain in Christopher's eyes, the weight that he carried. They formed an unlikely friendship, a bond built on shared secrets and unspoken understanding. The stranger, whose name was Alex, was a former thief, a man who had once been as ruthless as Christopher. But he had found redemption, a path to a new life. He shared his experiences with Christopher, offering guidance and support. Alex helped Christopher understand that the past was the past. It could not be changed, but it could be learned from. He encouraged him to embrace the present, to focus on the future, and to let go of the guilt that had been consuming him. With Alex's help, Christopher began to see the world in a new light. He started to appreciate the simple things in life, the quiet moments of joy and peace. He found solace in nature, in the beauty of the surrounding countryside. One day, while hiking in the woods, Christopher stumbled upon an abandoned cabin. It was a hidden gem, a place of solitude and tranquility. He decided to renovate the cabin, turning it into a sanctuary, a place where he could escape the noise of the world and reconnect with himself. As he worked on the cabin, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. He was creating something tangible and lasting. He was rebuilding his life one piece at a time. Sheila, meanwhile, was thriving in her new life. She had found love, a simple, honest love with a kind and gentle man named Ethan. They were planning their wedding, a small, intimate ceremony in the heart of the town. As the wedding day approached, Christopher felt a wave of happiness wash over him. He was truly happy for Sheila, happy for them both. He had found peace, redemption, and a future filled with hope. The wedding day was perfect, a day filled with laughter, love, and joy. As Christopher watched Sheila walk down the aisle, he couldn't help but smile. He had come so far, from the dark depths of the underworld to the light of a new beginning. The future was uncertain, of course, but for the first time in a long time, Christopher felt optimistic. He had faced his demons, conquered his fears, and found a path to redemption. He was ready for whatever the future held. The city was a place of chaos, a jungle of steel and glass that never slept. But for Christopher and Sheila, it was a place of regret, suffocating memories, and blood-stained pasts that they could never escape. Their story, once filled with glittering opportunities and promises of power, had slowly devolved into a nightmare of violence, betrayal, and crushing guilt. They were no longer the people they used to be, the people they had to become to survive the underworld they once ruled. They had been hardened, their hearts scarred, and their souls shattered. But the world had a way of pushing people to the edge, forcing them to make choices that either led to salvation or damnation. After a series of fateful events, the two of them knew the time had come to leave, to start anew. They had to vanish from the life they once knew and retreat into the unknown. So they did. They took only what they could carry and fled the concrete jungle that had once been their playground. They left behind the city's high-rise buildings and its cruel, unrelenting underworld. Their destination was a small town that held no significance to anyone, a quiet, inconspicuous place far from the people who might recognize them. The journey was long and exhausting. The car they drove sputtered along winding roads, miles away from any semblance of civilization. The silence in the car was suffocating, unspoken words that neither dared to say. They were both lost in their own worlds, haunted by the ghosts of their past. There was no comfort to be found in their shared misery, no solace in the fact that they were together. Their journey wasn't just a physical one. It was an emotional exodus, an escape from their very selves. When they finally reached the town, it was late in the evening. The sky cast in hues of violet and gold as the sun dipped below the horizon. The town was small, its streets empty save for a few stragglers making their way home. It looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. The simplicity of it all was both a balm and a burden. The weight of their past was still heavy on their shoulders, but in this small town, they could vanish. They could be anyone and they could be free. But freedom came at a price. They had no money, no plans, and no real future. They needed work and they needed to be inconspicuous. Sheila found the job first as a waitress at the local diner. The owner, an elderly woman named Mabel, had greeted her with a warm smile and a kind heart. Mabel didn't ask questions, which was a blessing, and Sheila's natural charm made her an instant favorite with the customers. Every morning, Sheila would dress in her uniform, tie her hair up in a neat ponytail, and serve coffee with a smile that could light up the darkest room. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. It was a new beginning. Christopher, meanwhile, took the job as a dishwasher, a humbling position that allowed him to keep to himself. His broad shoulders, once used to commanding attention, were now bent in quiet labor. He worked hard, hiding behind piles of dirty dishes and the loud clattering of silverware. His silence spoke volumes, but no one seemed to mind. They let him be, and in return he did his work without complaint. The town embraced them with open arms, their troubled pasts unnoticed by the townsfolk. The people here were kind and simple, unaware of the dangerous world that Christopher and Sheila had left behind. They were given a second chance, a chance to be different, to be better. And for a while it worked. But for Christopher, peace didn't come easily. It was only in the quiet of the night, as he lay in bed, that the nightmares would come. The memories of bloodshed, gunfire, and betrayal would return, relentless and suffocating. He would wake in a cold sweat, heart racing, terrified that someone would find out what he had done, that the past would finally catch up with him. Sheila, on the other hand, seemed to be adjusting with more grace. She'd become a beloved member of the community. Everyone knew Sheila at the diner. She was a comforting presence to the elderly who came in for their morning coffee, a caring soul who always had a kind word for everyone. Sheila was trying her best to let go of the darkness she'd carried for so long. She wanted to forget, to believe that maybe she was worthy of a second chance. But Christopher couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't running far enough. The town, despite its serenity, was about to change. It began with the arrival of a stranger. Alex was a man who seemed to have wandered in from nowhere, a tall figure with a rugged look and a presence that immediately drew attention. He wasn't particularly handsome, but his sharp eyes and the quiet confidence with which he carried himself gave him an air of mystery. It was clear from the moment he walked into the diner that he was no ordinary traveler. He wasn't much for small talk, But when he took a seat at the counter and ordered his coffee, his eyes never left Christopher's. It was subtle, but there was something in the way Alex watched him, a knowing glance that sent a chill down Christopher's spine. Christopher quickly looked away, focusing on the dishes in front of him, but the feeling of being seen, truly seen, never left. Over the following days, Alex returned to the diner again and again. He never engaged with the other customers, but he always made a point to sit near Christopher. It was unnerving, but it wasn't long before Christopher realized that Alex wasn't a stranger at all. He had been through the same darkness. One evening, after closing time, as Christopher was stacking the last of the plates, Alex approached him. "You're running from something," Alex said, his voice low and steady. Christopher froze. He hadn't said a word to Alex, hadn't shared anything about his past. Yet somehow Alex knew. "I'm not here to judge you," Alex continued. "I've been there. We've all been there." That night, they sat together in the quiet diner, sharing the silence before their words began to spill out. Christopher learned that Alex, like him, had once been part of the underworld. A thief who had stolen not just for survival, but for the thrill of it. A man who had turned his back on his crimes and sought a path to redemption. He had done the unthinkable, he had made amends. But it wasn't easy. "You can't outrun your past," Alex said. "It's always with you, lurking in the shadows. But you don't have to let it define you." Christopher listened, his heart heavy with a longing for the peace Alex seemed to have found. For the first time in years, Christopher felt understood. He realized that perhaps he didn't need to run forever. Maybe, with the right guidance, he could confront his demons and find peace. Days turned into weeks, and under Alex's guidance, Christopher began to change. He started to let go of the constant guilt, the fear that someone would come for him, and instead focused on the simple joys that life had to offer. He spent more time outdoors, taking long walks through the woods that bordered the town. The beauty of the surrounding landscape, the trees that swayed in the wind, and the crisp air gave him a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in years. It was on one of these walks that Christopher stumbled upon the cabin. Hidden deep in the woods, the small structure was weathered by time, the paint peeling from its walls, but there was something about it that drew him in. It was secluded, a perfect place to be alone. The cabin was run down, abandoned for years, but it called to him. It felt like the perfect place to escape the world. For the next few months, Christopher worked tirelessly on the cabin. He fixed the roof, patched the walls, and cleared the overgrown weeds that had choked its foundation. He poured all of his energy into it, finding solace in the steady rhythm of his work. It was a physical labor that brought him peace, each nail hammered into place a step toward rebuilding his life. One evening, as he stood back and admired his work, he realized that the cabin wasn't just a project. It was his redemption. It was a tangible way to atone for the wrongs of his past. He wasn't just building a shelter, he was building a new life. While Christopher found solace in the cabin, Sheila had found her own happiness. The gentle, kind Ethan, a farmer who had lived in the town his whole life, had swept her off her feet. He was nothing like the men she had known before. There was no darkness in his eyes, no cruelty in his heart. With Ethan, Sheila felt safe, loved, and valued. Ethan had asked Sheila to marry him, and she had said yes without hesitation. The wedding was to be a small affair, an intimate ceremony in the town's chapel, surrounded by the people who had become her new family. As the day of the wedding approached, Christopher couldn't help but feel a sense of joy for her. He had watched her struggle for so long, and now she had found a love that was pure and untainted. He had healed, and she had too. On the morning of the wedding, Christopher stood in the back of the chapel, watching Sheila walk down the aisle in a simple white dress. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the warmth of happiness. His journey had been long and painful, but he had finally found peace. He had come so far, from the depths of despair to the light of redemption. And as he watched Sheila marry the man she loved, Christopher knew that the future was no longer a terrifying unknown. It was a promise that redemption, though a hard one, was always worth the fight. The small town of Willow Creek was a world away from the bustling metropolis they had escaped. The quiet streets, the friendly faces, and the slow pace of life offered a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. Yet, even in this idyllic setting, the past continued to cast its long shadow. Christopher and Sheila had settled into their new lives, finding work and making friends. But the darkness that had once consumed them was never far away. It lurked in the shadows of their minds, ready to pounce at any moment. One day, while working at the diner, Sheila received a phone call that would change everything. It was an old friend, someone from her past, someone who knew the truth about their past. The news was devastating. Someone from their old life was in trouble, and they needed help. Reluctantly, Christopher and Sheila agreed to help their old friend. It was a dangerous game, one that could put them back in the crosshairs of the underworld. But they couldn't turn their backs on someone in need, especially not when they knew the consequences of ignoring such a plea. Their journey back to the city was filled with trepidation and fear. The streets, once familiar, now seemed hostile and threatening. Every shadow, every sound, made them jumpy, their senses heightened. They moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. Their mission was successful, but it came at a cost. The old life had reasserted its hold on them, threatening to pull them back into its dark embrace. They had escaped the city once, but could they do it again? They returned to Willow Creek, exhausted and shaken. The quietude of the town was a welcome relief, but it was also a stark reminder of the fragile peace they had built. They realized that they couldn't escape their past forever. They had to confront it, to face their demons head-on. With Alex's guidance, they began to rebuild their lives, one step at a time. They focused on their newfound happiness, the simple joys of their small-town existence. They found solace in the company of good people, in the beauty of nature, and in the quiet moments of reflection. But the past never truly goes away. It lingers in the shadows, ready to strike when least expected. A new threat emerged, a dangerous organization that had learned of their past. They were hunted, their every move watched, their every action scrutinized. Once again, Christopher and Sheila found themselves fighting for their lives, their well-being, and their freedom. They were forced to use the skills they had once thought they had abandoned to navigate the treacherous waters of the underworld. The fight was long and arduous, but they faced it with courage and determination. They fought for their lives, for their well-being, and for the hope of a future free from the chains of their past. In the end, they emerged victorious, but at a great cost. They had lost friends, they had been pushed to their limits, and they had been forced to confront the darkest parts of themselves. But they had also learned valuable lessons about resilience, courage, and the power of love. They returned to Willow Creek, forever changed by their ordeal. They were stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever before. They knew that the past would always be a part of them, but they also knew that it didn't define them. They were masters of their own destiny, and they would choose a path that led to a brighter future. The small town of Willow Creek continued to be their sanctuary, a place where they could find peace and happiness. They had faced their demons, overcome their fears, and emerged as stronger individuals. Their story was a testament to the human spirit, a testament to their bond, and a testament to the possibility of redemption. The quiet town of Willow Creek had become a safe haven for Christopher and Sheila. Their decision to leave the city behind, to escape the madness, was made with the hope of finding peace, a fresh start where the past couldn't follow. But even in the serenity of this small town, their past loomed like a dark cloud, always just out of sight but never far from their thoughts. Their lives in Willow Creek had not been without their challenges, but with each passing day, they felt themselves drifting further away from the ghosts that had haunted them for so long. Christopher had found work at a local mechanic's shop, while Sheila worked as a waitress at the town's diner. The people were kind, the air was fresh, and life seemed simple again. They lived in a small, modest house on the edge of town, surrounded by trees and nature, a far cry from the concrete jungle they had left behind. Despite the tranquility, the truth remained. Christopher and Sheila knew that they couldn't escape their past forever. They had tried to put it behind them, but it wasn't something that could be simply erased. Their mistakes, and the people they had wronged were still out there, lurking in the shadows, ready to pull them back into the chaos. It was on a bright, unsuspecting afternoon that everything began to unravel. Sheila was wiping down the counter at the diner when the phone rang. It wasn't unusual for the phone to ring, but this call was different. She could tell before she even answered. Her heart sank when she saw the name on the caller ID. It was an old friend from their past, someone they hadn't heard from in years. The kind of friend that you didn't want to hear from again. The kind that brought trouble with every call. Sheila? The voice on the other end was familiar, but it sent chills down her spine. We need your help. It took Sheila a moment to compose herself. Her breath caught in her throat as memories of their past life flooded her mind. She had hoped that this day would never come, but it had. What do you want? Sheila's voice trembled, betraying the fear she was trying to suppress. Something's gone wrong, Sheila. You need to come back. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about survival. Her mind raced, but the decision had already been made for her. There was no turning back. Christopher needed to know. She quickly hung up and rushed to the mechanic's shop to find him. Christopher had just finished working on an old Ford when Sheila burst through the door, her face pale, eyes wide with panic. What happened? He asked, wiping grease from his hands. They know, Sheila said breathlessly. They found us. Our past, it's come back. Christopher's heart skipped a beat. He felt the weight of her words like a ton of bricks pressing down on him. The life they had built here, the peace they had fought so hard for, it was all hanging by a thread. Who's found us? He asked, though he already knew the answer. People from the city. They need our help, Chris. I know we said we'd leave it all behind, but we can't just walk away from this. Not now. Christopher stared at her, the inner turmoil evident on his face. He had tried to forget, to shut away the darker parts of his soul, but now they were coming for him, coming for them both. He didn't want to go back, didn't want to face the people who had once controlled their lives. But he also knew that turning his back on this request would only make things worse. The stakes were too high. Fine, he said finally. We'll go. But only this once. After that, we're done. The journey back to the city was long and filled with dread. The roads that once felt like a path to freedom now felt like a descent into hell. As they neared the city limits, Christopher could see the skyline in the distance. A stark reminder of the life they had left behind. A life filled with danger, deceit, and crime. They had promised themselves they would never return to this world. But here they were, about to walk right back into it. The past had never truly let them go. Their mission was simple enough. Help the friend who had called them, fix the mess, and get out. But as they arrived at the old warehouse where their contact awaited, it became clear that things were far more complicated than they had imagined. The moment they stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them. There were men everywhere, shadows in the corners, eyes watching them from the darkness. The friend who had called them was nowhere to be found. A familiar voice broke the silence, and Christopher's heart sank. He knew that voice. He'd heard it too many times before. Well, the man said, stepping forward. It was Victor, a former associate from their old life. I didn't think you'd come back, but I'm glad you did. Sheila's hands trembled, and Christopher's mind raced. This wasn't just about helping an old friend. It was a trap, a setup. They had been brought back here for a reason, and that reason was not to help anyone. Victor's men moved in, surrounding them. The air was thick with tension. You should have stayed away, Christopher. You and Sheila. You both had the chance to walk away clean. But now you've crossed the wrong people, Victor sneered, his eyes narrowing. They were cornered. The only way out was through Victor, but that meant facing their old life, their past mistakes. There was no other option. They had to fight. A brutal confrontation followed, with Christopher and Sheila using everything they had learned from their time in the underworld. But even as they fought, the overwhelming sense of being trapped hung over them like a guillotine. Every move they made felt like a step closer to death. They escaped, but the damage had been done. The consequences of their actions were coming for them, faster than they could outrun. A week later, they were back in Willow Creek, exhausted, broken, and scarred. The brief respite they had found in the small town seemed like a lifetime ago. Their lives, once again, were in danger. And now there was a new threat: the law. A tip-off had been made, and the authorities had been alerted to their past crimes. Despite their attempts to lay low, the past had finally caught up with them. They were both arrested, and the small town that had once offered them solace now felt like a prison. Christopher and Sheila were taken to court. The charges against them were severe, and the evidence, while circumstantial, was enough to put them away for a long time. Sheila, in particular, was facing the brunt of the charges. Her involvement in various illicit activities was well documented, and the prosecution was determined to make an example of her. The trial was a media circus, with reporters from all over the country descending on Willow Creek. The small-town atmosphere had turned hostile, with townspeople divided over what should happen to the two of them. As the days passed, the courtroom drama unfolded in front of a captivated audience. The defense team worked tirelessly to prove that Christopher and Sheila had reformed, that their past was not an accurate reflection of who they were now. They had left the underworld behind, they argued. They had tried to build a new life, but the prosecution was relentless. Sheila was painted as the mastermind behind the operations, the one who had manipulated Christopher into a life of crime. The jury was swayed by the evidence, by the testimonies of those who had once been their enemies. It all came to a head when the verdict was read. The courtroom fell silent as the judge spoke. "Christopher, you are hereby released from all charges. You are free to go." The room erupted in whispers, but Christopher barely heard them. His mind was spinning. He had been given a second chance, but at what cost? "And as for you, Sheila, you are hereby sentenced to 10 years in prison." Sheila's heart shattered as the words echoed in her ears. 10 years. Her past had caught up with her, and now she would pay the price. She looked at Christopher, her face a mixture of anger and regret. "You'll be fine, Chris," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You'll be fine." As the guards led her away, Christopher stood frozen, unable to speak. His heart ached for her, but he knew that she had made her choices, and now she would face the consequences. The door slammed shut behind Sheila as she was led to the holding cells, and Christopher was left standing in the courtroom alone with Sheila's husband, wondering what the future held for him. He had been given freedom, but at what cost? Would he ever truly be free from the shadows of his past? Or would they always be a part of him, haunting him with the mistakes of those who had gone before? Only time would tell. For now, he had one thing to hold on to: the hope that redemption was still possible, that he could rebuild his life, piece by piece. As the days turned into weeks, Christopher and Sheila found a rhythm in their new life. The quiet town, once a temporary refuge, had become their haven. The weight of their past, though never truly gone, had lessened. But their past was never far behind. One evening, as Christopher was working on his cabin, he received a phone call. It was a number he didn't recognize. A voice, cold and menacing, spoke on the other end. It was a voice from his past, a reminder of the life he had left behind. "We know where you are," the voice said, a sinister chuckle echoing through the line. "And we're coming for you." Fear gripped Christopher. The past was catching up with him. He knew he had to act fast. He contacted Alex, who, despite his own struggles, offered his help. Alex had connections, people who could help them disappear. With Alex's help, Christopher and Sheila devised a plan. Christopher would break Sheila out of jail. They would leave the town and disappear without a trace. It was a risky move, but it was their only chance. After Christopher broke Sheila out of jail, they packed their belongings, said their goodbyes to the people who had become a part of their new life, and left under the cover of darkness. Meanwhile, Sheila's husband filed for a divorce. Christopher and Sheila traveled for days. Their destination, a small island nation in the Caribbean. A place with no extradition laws, a place where they could truly disappear. The journey was long and arduous, filled with uncertainty and fear, but they persevered, driven by the hope of a new beginning. When they finally arrived, they were greeted by the warm sun and the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. The island was everything they had hoped for. A paradise of white sand beaches, crystal clear waters, and lush greenery. It was a place where they could start over, a place where their past wouldn't follow them. They found a small cottage by the sea, a humble abode that was perfect for their needs. They spent their days exploring the island, swimming in the ocean, and simply enjoying the beauty of their surroundings. They had found peace, a sense of tranquility that they hadn't experienced in years. But their past was never far away. The threat of their pursuers loomed large, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked in the shadows. They had to be vigilant, always looking over their shoulders, always ready to flee. One day, as they were strolling along the beach, they saw a familiar face. It was Marcus, their former mentor, their former tormentor. He had found them. Marcus had been relentless in his pursuit. He had tracked them across the globe, determined to bring them back into his world. He offered them a deal: return to his side or face the consequences. Christopher and Sheila knew they couldn't trust Marcus. He was a man who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. They refused his offer, knowing that it would lead to their downfall. The confrontation that followed was brutal. Marcus, with his army of henchmen, was determined to capture them. But Christopher and Sheila, fueled by desperation, fought back. They used their skills, their cunning, and their knowledge of the underworld to outsmart their pursuers. In the end, they managed to escape, but not without a cost. Their paradise had been shattered, their newfound peace disrupted. They were forced to flee once again, this time to an even more remote location. They found refuge in a small village in the mountains, a place untouched by the modern world. The villagers were simple people, living off the land, and they welcomed Christopher and Sheila with open arms. They were given a small cottage, a place to call their own. In this remote village, Christopher and Sheila finally found the peace they had been searching for. They lived a simple life, growing their own food and trading with the villagers. They were safe, hidden away from the world they had once known. But they never forgot the life they had left behind. They carried the scars of their past with them, a constant reminder of the price of their freedom. They knew that they could never truly escape their past, that it would always be a part of them. Still, they found hope in the future. And as it was bound to happen, they had finally found love together, a love that was pure and true. They had found a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. They had found a new beginning. And so Christopher and Sheila lived on. They had survived the darkness, emerged from the shadows, found a way to live and a way to escape the jury of their own peers.